a writer friend of mine told me when I first started writing. We were talking, and I was talking about my mother making grits every morning, and sitting around the dinner table and going to the hairdresser, and just all these kinds of things that were in some of my stories. And he stopped me and he said, Tina, that's gold, Gold. And I think of the gold running through all of us like a vein, you know. But gold doesn't mean anything unless you mine it, get it out of the ground. Then you got to make sure it's not fool's gold, it's real gold. Then you make it into something, you refine it, with fire. Then you make it into jewelry or a goblet or, whatever you're going to make it into. Use it in art. But that's when it becomes valuable, when you go in and mine it.
I have 2 words for you. Are you ready? Right now. That's it. Right now. Those 2 words can change your life. If there's anything you're dreaming of becoming, of doing, of having, of achieving, of sharing, or giving, right now. Those are the words. Think about it. Right now. I grew up in Macon, Georgia in the 50s and 60s, at the time when African American people told stories all the time. Sitting on the porch at funerals, at weddings, after church on Sunday. They told stories to calm children down to go to sleep. Stories were all around. My father owned juke joints and liquor stores, and I used to go after school. I'd go to Catholic school, and I would go down after school with my little plaid uniform on and sit at the counter next to winos and prostitutes and regular people and boosters and pickpockets and the principal of the school. When I was growing up, everybody sort of went to the juke joint. It wasn't a sort of underworld kind of place to be. It was a place where people just gathered. So I had all these people around me and all these stories, and I would hear people just talking. I'm a big eavesdropper. And so I would overhear stories, and so the stories just seemed to be everywhere. Books and ideas and words were important in my house. And by my mother's bedside table, there were books. And she had a reading chair, a big pink sitting chair in the living room. And that was her reading chair. And so she loved being a mother. She was a very accessible mother, but not when she was reading. And that made a big impression on me. So I'm a writer for all those reasons, because I think I was given a gift of the talent to be able to write. But the biggest gift I was given was to know how important words are, and how important stories are. I graduated from Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia in 1971. And although I have many, many wonderful memories of Spelman, the one that stands out in my mind is the moment when I knew I was a writer. That's where it happened. Dr. Gloria Wade Gales, an author, a poet, at the time was just out of graduate school teaching her first college courses. And she taught me African American literature. I did a paper on Zora Neale Hurston, whom had just been rediscovered at the time. This was in the late 60s, early 70s. And I got an A on the paper. And when I went to Dr. Gales to tell her how excited I was about the paper, she said the most important words that have ever been spoken to me. She said, "You're a writer, don't you know that?" And although I had always known I was a writer, although growing up in Macon, Georgia, I was always told I was going to be a writer. My family always said, Tina's going to be a writer. Anytime they caught me reading a book, anytime John Oliver Killings, who grew up in Macon, Georgia, was mentioned, went to school with my father, anytime he was mentioned, someone would say, well, Tina's going to be a writer. I'd heard it my whole life, but I'd never heard it from a professor. I'd never heard it from a writer. And she said it so matter-of-factly, don't you know you're a writer? I was a journalist. From the time I was out of college until now. I still consider myself a journalist. That was my first job. I was an editor, copy editor at the Atlanta Constitution in 1971. I was the first black woman at the Atlanta Constitution, if you can believe it. Like many people, I found that it was very difficult for me to hold down a full-time job and to write. People will say, especially if you work for a newspaper, well, you've just been writing all day, just come home and continue to write. My God, the hardest thing in the world, not only to make the transition from journalism to fiction, for instance, is a very hard transition to make, but also just how tired you are. You have to be fresh, and you have to be thoughtful, and you want to create something wonderful. It's very difficult too. And so I found that I had to take a break. My husband was very instrumental in this. He told me, I tell you what, I'll handle the household stuff. I'll handle making some money so we can eat and have a roof over our heads. And, if you're going to write, you're going to be serious about this, going to be serious. And that's what I did. I took some time off and concentrated on my fiction.
Drove from Atlanta down here, and when we got here, it was nighttime. The day after we got married, my husband, Shanae, and I. And when we drove across the bridge, it was just a 2-lane drawbridge from the mainland to St. Simon's. It's a causeway now, but it was just a 2-lane drawbridge. And just as we got past the marina, just as we got on the island, I heard a man's voice that said, "This is where you belong." And I've told that story a lot, and I forget when I tell it for the first time just how unusual that is. I've kind of gotten used to it. And I know a lot of people say, yeah, you're just embossing because, you're a writer and all of that. But it wasn't. It was a man's voice. I couldn't tell whether it was a black man or a white man. It wasn't a booming voice, but it was a male voice. And it said, "This is where you belong." And so I looked at my husband who was driving, and he looked at me. And I didn't say anything because this didn't happen to me every day. This was unusual. And so he said, "What was that?" And so I said, "What was what?" Then he said, "I don't know. It was something." I said, "Did you hear a voice?" He said, "No, it wasn't a voice." He said, "It wasn't music." He said, "I don't know what it was. It was a sound, something I heard." And that's when I told him I heard this man's voice. And from that moment on, this is in '78, I knew that this is where I was supposed to be. And my father brought me home one time. We didn't have a working car when we first sometimes when we got here. And I would get on a Greyhound bus and go to Macon, my home. I went there for a workshop with John Oliver Killings, who I mentioned earlier, who was from Macon. He came back after like 45 years and did workshops in Macon. And all you had to do was have a piece of work. You had to show that you had something that you were working on, a work in progress. It could be anything. And you got into this workshop for free. And, I did that. During the workshop, I had a story that became a chapter in my first book, Baby of the Family. And it was about a little girl going up the street to get her hair done at the neighborhood beauty shop. It was in the back of somebody's house. And because he went there because she was tender-headed and nobody could stand to hear her. So she had big, thick red hair and nobody could stand to hear her cry. And I would send it off and get rejections because nobody was, publishing short stories by unpublished authors, and that's where I was. I sent it to Toni Morrison at Random House, and she sent me a nice note back. But they were all rejected, and so this was probably what I had been sending off. And so he read it, and we were sitting all close to him. Everybody was at his feet because he was just so wonderful. And so he had read my story, or maybe I read it aloud. And he looked down at me. I was sitting at his feet. And he said, Beavy McElroy's daughter. That's my daddy. They call him Beavy. Beavy McElroy's daughter, a writer. And then he said, a good one, too. Oh, my God. I can still feel how thrilling that was. I wanted to we were sitting around. I was like sitting literally at his feet. I just wanted to grab him around his feet and just hug him. But I was, too in awe to do that. But it was just that feeling. So I had those, that sort of written when I came here. And from that, I realized that I could write. I had a writer friend, Bill Deal, who was a big deal. He was an established writer, and he said, "Hey, you read what I'd shown John Oliver Killings," and he says, "Oh, this is great." He says, "If you give me 100 pages, he said I'll show it to my agent." And his agent at the time was Owen Laster, and Owen Laster was head of the literary department at William Morris. And so and Bill did. I got about 130 pages because it got good to me, and we sent them off, and I got my first agent was a William Morris agent.
Some of us are going to get to heaven, and the first thing God's going to say to us is, "Hey, why didn't you open all those gifts I gave you?" And arranged around the heavenly throne, there are going to be stacks and stacks of gaily and luxuriously wrapped presents with organza and roses tied to them and grosgrain ribbons and satin ribbons around them. And it's going to be full of gifts that God gave us that we never opened. Stop for a while. Think about it. What gifts do you have that you're not using? What packages did God give you that you haven't even opened yet? Don't go to heaven with your packages unwrapped. Unwrap them suckers.